Hello, everybody. Let's have a mystical conversation, the kind where we lose ourselves in the wonders of divine mysteries, share dreams from the other side, intuitive nudgings, and soul mission yearnings. A mystical conversation is what happens when we lift above our ego mind, our human story, and we look at our lives from that higher place of divine inspiration. I'm Sue Frederick. I'm the author of several books, including Through a Divine Lens, Bridges to Heaven, and I See Your Dream Job. I'm a lifelong intuitive, a master numerologist, ordained unity minister, and soul regression therapist. Yes, I am an overachiever because I'm trying to understand life and death. It takes a lot of study, people. And I've helped thousands of clients find their way through this dense world that we call humanity, human world, earth world, whatever you want to call it. And I've met so many souls along the way, like our incredible guest today, Brian Smith. So let me read his bio. He is such a beautiful soul. And I want to start by saying I met him through Helping Parents Heal, because Helping Parents Heal is what we all adore, because it is shifting consciousness about life and death. And Brian is on the board of directors, and he's a volunteer for Helping Parents Heal. So shout out to Helping Parents Heal. Brian is also a grief guide, a life purpose coach, a small business consultant. His mission is to help people rediscover who they are and why they are here. And in those two questions lie the secrets to not only surviving life, but thriving. I agree with that. He became well acquainted with grief in 2015 after the sudden passing of his 15-year-old daughter, Shayna. After Shayna's passing, he felt life was over. He had to learn to survive for the sake of his wife, Tawana, and his daughter, Kayla. Brian studied the nature of life and death and how to progress through grief of all kinds. Brian helps people understand that death is not goodbye and that your relationship with your loved one continues. His understanding is not a religious-based belief, but a position arrived at based on reason and evidence. Shortly after Shayna transitioned, Brian found Helping Parents Heal, the nonprofit support group for parents of children who have crossed. He volunteers, he's on the board, and also, don't you have a grief certificate from David Kessler as well, Brian?
Yes, I do. Yes.
That's right. So he's a David Kessler trained grief coach. And he's also the author of Grief to Growth, Planted, Not Buried. And he's the host and creator of the Grief to Growth podcast. Now, I got to say, anybody who's lost a loved one, you have to read his book, Grief to Growth, because he starts where you are in the logic mind, trying to figure out what could have happened because his life had fallen apart. So, Brian, I'm going to start reading a quote from your book that just brought me to tears, and then you can talk. Brian writes in his book, I no longer believe in an afterlife any more than I believe the sun will rise tomorrow. It's not a belief, it's a knowing based on experience, including signs, studying after-death communications, medium readings, and scientific evidence ranging from controlled studies to the mountains of data from near-death experiences, shared death experiences, quantum mechanics, and philosophy. Well, say hello, Brian, and tell us a little about Shayna.
Oh, thanks for having me here, Sue. Yeah, about Shayna. Shayna she was 15 years old when she passed away in June 24th of 2015. She was an incredible child. Of course, we all think our children are incredible, but Shayna was a beautiful girl, very popular. It was interesting. We homeschooled her for the first 8 years of her life. So she didn't go to public school until she was in 8th grade, but got right into school. She was very popular. She played basketball at a national level. She went to national finals for basketball. Then she switched to volleyball. She played volleyball up until actually the weekend before she passed away. She played a national tournament. She passed away suddenly, as I said, June 24th, of a heart condition. It was undiagnosed. She did have a condition called Wolff Parkinson's White, which we were familiar with. She had been treated for, but they said that was not life threatening. So she was healthy, thriving, 15-year-old girl. And then she just didn't wake up one day. So that was the beginning of the end for me.
Yeah. So you have so many things in that story that people can relate to about grief. And one of them is that for you, it was so sudden and unexpected because we never expect our children to cross before we do. And also the trauma of you and your wife, finding Shayna crossed.
Mm-hmm.
And I am just amazed at how quickly you began to say, I have to figure this out. But I also know that you lost a grandmother early on in your life and that you had been drawn to studying the afterlife, right? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, even before my grandmother passed, I was raised in a religion that I would call toxic. I was told that God was judgmental, that we were born with an original sin, that the only way to be saved was through the sacrifice of Jesus and accepting his blood and stuff like that. And as a child on this planet, I felt very disoriented. I was like, why am I here? Why is God so angry at me? Why is he so angry at everybody else? Even if I have managed to save myself somehow, what about all the other people? It just didn't make a lot of sense to me. So this led to, by the time I was a teenager, I was having panic attacks. And this went on for many years. Finally got into counseling. But yeah, I had what I call it thanatophobia, which is, we all have a natural fear of death. I had an unnatural fear of death. I feared it from the time I was young, and I always thought it was going to be sudden, just the way my daughter went, which is really ironic, if you want to call it that. Started about the time I was her age with the panic attacks, the age she was when she passed. So yeah, I had done a lot of studying before Shane had passed, but of course, it was all on an academic level, right? I didn't have to put it to practice until after her transition.
Mm-hmm. So what was the first moment where you began to say, I do feel her presence after she had crossed?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because the blessing for me was I knew Shayna was okay. So, most of the time when we lose a child or we lose someone, the first thought is, where are they? Are they okay? Because of the studies I'd done, I knew she was okay. What I didn't realize at the time was I could still have a relationship with her, and that she would still be with me. So when I started realizing that was probably, I don't know, it was several months after she had passed, probably. I probably around the time someone, and this was a whole series of synchronicities. I was on Facebook and someone said you should reach out to Mark Ireland. Was one of the co-founders of Helping Parents Heal. He sent me his books. Mark and I started talking. Then I met Elizabeth Boisson, and so that's when it started to come together for me that I could continue to have a relationship with Shayna.
Well, that's beautiful because I can relate in a way. In fact, I want to share with our listeners a little numerology here. Brian is a Gemini 11 master soul. So as we talk about in my numerology, the Gemini means he's going to be a researcher. He's going to try to figure out the answer to life and be very logical about it, which is so perfect for the Gemini. And then yet his heart and his soul is the 11, tender, emotional, intuitive, sensitive self that he doesn't want to show to the world. That's okay. That's how it is. But that's his essence, which would be perfect for saying, yes, I'm going to figure this out. And then, oh my gosh, I feel this happening. And that's the shift from here's what I believe to here's what I know. Another thing you say that I love in your book, and you say grief happens when our mental image of what should be doesn't line up with what is. Grief happens when we lose hope of seeing them again. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, for myself, I believe the only way that I can deal with my grief is productively is to have that hope that I'm going to see her again. Hope is, if human beings have hope, we can endure anything. And if we don't have hope, we really pretty much can't endure anything. It's really quite, that's that simple. Um, so the thing for me is understanding who we are, why we're here, and where we're going. I think if we can understand that, it softens the grief. It doesn't take it away. I still miss her. I still miss her physical presence. I still sometimes wish things were different, but it softens it. It's kind of like if someone, when someone goes away on vacation, we miss them, but we don't despair. We don't grieve because we expect them to come back. When someone passes away, we know we're not going to see them for maybe a little bit longer, but knowing I'm going to see her again makes it so much easier to deal with.
And have you, I've never asked you this before, but at what point did you decide that you were going to make it your work in the world to help people with grief and to write these books and these podcasts? What was your career or your focus before she crossed, and how has it changed?
Well, my grandfather was a minister. He was the pastor of the church I grew up in. Both of his parents were ministers. So I always felt this kind of a calling to teach and to help people. But in the Christian tradition, it wasn't going to work out for me. And I was a sales rep. My wife and I own a hair care company, hair and skincare company. It's an online company. So I'm an entrepreneur. We've been doing that for 22 years now. So when Shayna, and I've always been a writer. My grandfather was a writer. My uncle was a writer. So it's kind of in my blood. It's in my nature. We just like to write and teach and stuff. So I was always looking for an outlet for that. I've had several websites. The first one I called the Council for Defense. It was an apologist website back when I was a Christian. And then I had one called The Beautiful Heresy when I found out about universalism. So I was espousing that. So when Shayna passed, it was a week later, I just got this inkling that I should start writing a blog. So it was for me, I just wanted to kind of document my journey. So I started writing the blog a week after Shayna passed. I'd already had The Beautiful Heresy, and I rolled that over into a blog dedicated to Shayna and to my grief journey.
I can relate to that so much because I'm a lifelong writer too. And I always tell people I can't even begin to understand life until I start writing about it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why I've written so many books. It's like a topic comes to me and I just need to understand it. And so the process of writing for me, like it sounds like for you, is of saying, okay, divine beings, channel this into me. I'm ready
Mm-hmm.
to take it and then share it with the world. Do you have another book you're working on?
I don't currently. Well, I do. I have one that I've kind of started, but I am so busy with other things right now that the book is kind of like that's going to be out a little bit.
Mhm. Well, what about your podcast? Tell us about that.
My podcast is Grief to Growth. It's Grief numeral two growth. I've had about 250 episodes, I think now. I interview people who are afterlife experts, people who have had near death experiences, people who are healers, people who have just overcome all different types of things that will inspire my audience. I've been very fortunate to interview some really really fantastic people to get the word out that this thing that we call death isn't real, that we are eternal beings here for a short period of time, and that we have a purpose, we have a reason for being here, and that life is to be enjoyed while we're here, but also that we have something to look forward to once this life is over. So it's on YouTube. It's on anywhere you can get podcasts, and
And it's called
I really enjoy
Grief to
doing it.
Growth. It's called Grief to Growth, like your book.
Grief to Go,
Awesome.
just like the book. Hmm.
And
Yeah.
then if somebody wanted to be coached by you, where would they go to have that happen?
My website is Grief to Growth, also numeral two growth.com. You can go there. You can find out about me. I do offer a free consultation. So 30 minutes or so. We'll talk about what it is you're trying to achieve, and you can learn more about me. And then I will put together a custom plan for the clients that I work with. So I'm doing that now. I'm also really happy now. I just launched a course. So people wanted a little bit easier way to get in touch with me or to take some lessons from me. So it's called Love Never Dies. And you can go to grief2growth.com/love never dies, just all one word all together. And it's an online course. It's a series of videos that kind of summarizes what my philosophy is on how I went from where I was to where I am now. And as I said earlier, and as you said in the book, I don't really like even using the word belief in the afterlife or faith in the afterlife any more than we have faith in the law of gravity or faith in that there's a China. You know, I've never been to China. I've heard about China. I know people that have been there. I've seen things that come from China. So I believe it exists. I believe it's similar with the afterlife. We have so much evidence of it that I don't like to call it a belief. It's a logical conclusion.
I totally agree with that, and I've been teaching grief stuff, gosh, for 20 years, just because my thing happened when I was quite young. I was 29 when my husband crossed, and that sent me on the journey.
Mm-hmm.
It took me a long time to get through my anger and blame and all that good stuff that we go through with grief. But what I will say is that I did come to the place where I was able to say to my students and clients, I'm not sharing something with you that I believe in. I'm sharing something that with every cell in my body I know is true. And I do believe that grieving people cannot embrace that their soul lives on and that their loved one lives on unless they have their own experience of it. And
Yeah.
so your work and my work is really, for me at least, about guiding people to have their own connection, I guide them through a meditation and a process, and then they write. So what do you do to help your people experience this on their own?
Well, there are many ways that our loved ones communicate with us. So the first thing is understanding that the ways are varied. Oftentimes, when people tell me they haven't heard from their loved one, it's because they're expecting a certain thing. It's like I need to have a dream visit, or I need to have an apparition, and it doesn't always work that way. A lot of times, they'll communicate through us through signs and synchronicities. It could be things with electronics. It could be animal behavior. Um, so there's all different types of ways. So first of all, I tell people is, keep your eyes and ears open for things that seem unusual, things that seem, out of the ordinary. Like I was talking to someone just yesterday, they said, I keep asking my loved one for help. Then they'll say like a week later something happened, but they don't give the credit to the loved one that actually influenced that, and they can influence things from the other side. So that's the first thing, is just understanding that they're there. So being open to it, asking for the signs when you go to bed at night, for example, if you want to have a dream visit, set an intention, say, please come and visit me in my dreams tonight. And, set an intention to remember the dream, because often we don't remember those. So there are a number of things that we can do to enhance that communication. And again, not comparing yourself to other people. It's really interesting because on my podcast, I've interviewed people who have had crazy stuff happen, just like things appearing and things disappearing, and seeing their loved one and getting text messages from them. So we might often say, well, I'm not getting that, or I'm not having a dream visit like they had. So therefore, I'm not hearing from our loved one. So trusting however they're communicating with you,
Yeah.
and learning that language. So sometimes it's sitting quietly and thinking about them and asking them to, let you feel their presence. So it's a subtle thing. It's not, for someone like myself, it's a very rational, objective kind of person. It's been difficult to learn to trust
Right.
that what I'm feeling is actually my daughter.
And that's the whole key right there, is trust. I really believe that every day of this physical life, we are in touch with spirits. We are in touch with the divine realms. But we have been so inbred in the left brain logical mind growing up, and even the fear of those realms through dogmatic religion that you described so well. And I grew up Catholic, so it was all about mortal sin and going to hell.
Right.
And so the fear of it, like I remember many times in my maybe early 20s before my husband died, where I would say, show me the other realms. And then I'd begin to get a sign and I'd get scared.
Mhm.
And and so my fear sort of kept me. But once Paul crossed and Chrissy crossed right after him, I was like, my fear was gone. I was like, I need to know now that they're okay. And then
Right.
they would both come through in different ways. And I think that's what you're saying that's so important is I think the spirit comes through in a way that's kind of like the way they were when they were here.
Mhm.
And so if your child was very talkative and communicative and kind of demanding, they're going to be pushing on you all day, nudging you, bothering you. And
Yeah,
if they were a
yeah.
little more quiet, it's going to be a little more subtle, but you can learn how to work with that. What do you feel about that?
I think it's absolutely true. With Shayna, she loves electronics, so I get a lot of things, through my phone, through things either working or not working, because sometimes things don't work because Shayna's, been messing with them. It's funny because she used to turn the ceiling light in our bedroom on all the time. We have a ceiling fan with a light on it, and it hadn't happened in quite a while. And went up to bed last night. My wife said, "Did you turn the light on?" I was like, "No, it was on again last night." So not
Maybe
sure what
she
that was
was
about.
maybe she was telling us that she's got this interview today. She's in
Yeah,
charge.
absolutely 100%, possible. She one time I had the podcast and I was looking on my phone at my podcast feed, and all the covers of my podcast have been changed to a picture of Shayna. It's a picture of Shayna when she was a child, one of my favorite pictures of her. She's stacking these blocks, and I'm like, how did this happen? And I freaked out because it's like, this is my podcast. So I went and looked at my feed on the web browser on my computer, and it was normal. And I went and looked somewhere else, and it was normal. And when I went back to the phone again, it was back to normal. But every single, I still to this day have no idea, how that happened. So
Yes,
she
you
will
do.
communicate.
Yes, you do, Brian.
Yeah, it's like she'll communicate through things like that. One time my computer just stopped working for a while, for about a week. And it was glitchy and it was off and on. I was talking to the guy with support, and he goes, "I think you need to buy a new computer. I don't know what's going on." And then it just started working again. And like it was not even a week later, I had a reading with a medium. She said, "Shayna says she messes with your computer." And I'm like, okay, so let's stop doing that.
Oh, that's so great. Well, I have a very important question to talk about. I noticed in your book that you said you and your wife, and I want to come back also and talk about your wife and daughter and how they're coping with all this, because I got to meet them at the Helping Parents Heal conference, and they're amazing light beings. So remind me, I want to talk about that. But in the
Sure.
meantime, you and your wife found a unity church. And as you know, I'm an ordained unity minister. So tell me about what that was that helped you or how you were drawn there.
Well, I haven't been really in the church for quite a while. My wife, I would go with her. We were going to an evangelical church because it was easy and it was, mass marketing and all that stuff. So we were going to this place, and I'm just like going along. And then when Shayna passed away, I told my wife, I said, "Look, I can't do this anymore," and she agreed because we weren't really getting anything out of it. So we found the Unity Church, and it was awesome. Just so open and loving and affirming, and non-denominational, and all that stuff. So attended the Unity Church for a long time. It's interesting now because my wife loves University or Unity of Phoenix.
Yeah.
So she actually, we don't go to church anymore, but she listens to that sermon every Sunday.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I tell people, if you're going to go to church, there are two denominations I like. I like United Church of Christ and Unity. I think they're both awesome.
That's so good. I think similar to you, I have needed to understand what and who God is my whole life, and I wouldn't settle with my Catholic childhood, and studied everything: Theosophy, Native American, Buddhism, Hinduism, Unity. And the thing that brought me finally to stick with Unity was simply the number one concept that this is an all good, all God universe, and that
Hmm.
God consciousness is within all of us. And when we go back and study the Bible and Jesus's story, to be aware of how it was rewritten through time. And
Right.
that stuff is just fascinating. We could do a whole hour conversation on that.
Yeah.
But as you know, there's so many places in the Bible where they do talk about communication with spirit, right?
Right. Right.
And
Well,
go ahead.
no, well, we're all spirit, right? So we're spirit that are in the flesh. And it's interesting because you mentioned Catholics, and Catholics pray to saints and they pray to, various other beings. They don't pray only to God. But there's a prohibition by some that you can't pray to someone that that's on the other side, or communicate with someone that on the other side. So it is very inconsistent. I think it's important to, as you said, study other faiths. And I think that 90%, more than 90% of faiths, they have things in common. We tend to focus on the differences, unfortunately. So as I said, I'm not a part of any particular church right now, but I've studied Hinduism, I've studied Buddhism, I've studied Kabbalah. I've studied the Bible to understand where it came from and what parts of it we can trust and what parts of it we can't trust. It's not a all or thing. It's not black and white. There's some good things and there's some things that aren't so good.
Brian, you should be a unity minister. You should.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
have all of the theology background of studying it, and it's so fascinating. When you study to be a unity minister, you get to study the history of Christianity and world religions, and
Right.
that stuff is the juiciest stuff. And I would even just say to anybody who's grieving right now, if you can find the energy to go and read some books about, the world religions and what they all believe in and don't believe in, and the history of Christianity, it'll help you make peace with the idea of either if you started out maybe an atheist where you don't believe in anything, wow, go back and study the whole history of humanity through the eyes of humanity seeking to understand why we've always known there's
Right.
more to this earth than just the physical.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And then the research, the scientific research, that's so important to talk about, quantum physics. And so tell me about your understanding of that, and also maybe about the Soul Phone project.
Well, again, you mentioned it. I didn't know this about myself, but you're spot on with the numerology thing. I've always, when I was a little kid, I used to take things apart because I would just to see how they worked. So my degrees in chemical engineering, I'm a very rational, like I want to know how this works person. So for me, when I had this faith that my parents had given me, which my heart rejected, right? So my heart said, no, this can't be right. There's got to be something different. So I was curious, is there any proof of any of this, right? Because I still have that Western mindset. I was raised, here. And so one of the first books I read, actually probably the first book I read on the afterlife, was called The Afterlife Experiments by Gary Schwartz. And it's ironic, I'm actually working with Gary now on the Soul Phone, over 20 years later. So reading Gary Schwartz, and there's so much out there now. And what I think is, science and religion were not always at odds. People started studying science because they believed that the universe was orderly because there was an orderly God that had created it. And they thought they could learn more about God by studying his creation. And then there was a split. And then, science said, well, we kind of have it from here. And religion said, well, you handle that part, you handle the material, we'll handle the spiritual, and we'll just divide these into two different things. We're starting to find out that's impossible to do, that you can't separate the spiritual from the physical. The physical is part of the spiritual. It's actually comes from the spiritual, and science is starting to come back around to that. So I see them as going along together, splitting up for a while, and they're coming back together now. And it's to me, it's really beautiful that we can study this from both perspectives. I mean, it's still important to trust our intuition, that trust our spirit and all that, but also we can use our intellect, and we can learn more about who we are and where we came from, and we can use them both together.
And that's a perfect summary of what a Gemini 11 master soul is all about, people. Blending that logic mind with the intuitive knowingness. That's beautiful. Oh, Brian, well done in your life. I have to say, Shana is so proud of you.
Thank you.
But also, how is your beautiful wife and Kayla, how are they navigating this journey?
Well, Kayla was 18 when Shayna passed away. So, and Shayna was 15. So, and they are twin flames. I mean, they're just almost like twins. For them to be 3 years apart, Kayla was kind of her mother slash best friend, you know. So when Shayna passed, it was difficult. It was very difficult for all of us, of course. Kayla, she was a freshman in college when it happened. She was going to be a physician's assistant. She was studying biology and all the pre-med stuff. And she's like, I don't really like this. So she said, what do I really want to do? So she wanted to be a mental health counselor. So she switched her major and she is now a mental health counselor. She's licensed LPC, and she's working as a behaviorist. She loves working with children. So I think Shayna really inspired her to like do what you love. You know, don't just do this because everybody expects you to do this. And so I really I've seen Kayla grow a lot in the 8 years since Shayna's passed. My wife is she wasn't really interested at all in this afterlife stuff before Shayna. I would, you know, she would read novels and I would sit and I'd read books about the afterlife. And since then, though, she's jumped in, you know, with both feet. She's a part of helping parents heal. She helped me lead the chapter here that we had for a while. Very involved in that, and you know, helping other parents. And you know, I see her growing, you know, spiritually a lot. It's interesting. We you know we share books now. Like I'll read a book, and she picked up a book the other day. Thich Nhat Hanh book I read like I don't know how many years ago, and I mean the pages are all even yellow and stuff. And she goes, "Have you read this book?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it's mine. See all the marks in it? That's mine." But it's interesting to see her, you know, coming around and opening up and really, you know, understanding, you know, who we are and why we're here and all that stuff as well.
Does she have a lot of signs from Shayna?
Yeah, we both get a lot of signs from Shane. I was going to tell you earlier, we were talking about, you know, feeling your loved ones. I think this is a really interesting story, and I know she won't mind me sharing it. Um, you know, she's trying to style stuff for the first time. She hadn't really meditated before, so she's learning how to meditate. And someone had given her some mandala beads, so she's using the beads and she's looking at the book and everything. And one day, a medium friend of ours calls us up and says, "I think Shayna says you have a question for me." And my wife goes, "Well, no, I can't think of a question." She goes, "Yeah, Shayna's here and she's saying you have a question for me. But before I give you, you know, before I answer the question," she goes, "I need to give you some evidence." And it's Shayna, she said, "Have you been using beads lately?" And my wife goes, "Yeah, I've been using these mandala beads." And she said something about, I think she said something about a book that came with them. And so it was like right on. She got it. So, you know, she says, "What's your question for Shayna?" And my wife goes, "Well, I guess the only thing I would think of is when I'm meditating, like my heart will start to race a little bit and I see the color purple in my mind's eye. You know, is that my daughter?"
Mm.
And the answer was yes, that was Shayna. So that's one of the ways that she experiences Shayna. And I wanted to say that to people. It's like it can be subtle. So sometimes it's just sitting and getting really quiet. And I've heard people say, I experience them as a touch on the top of my head, or I experience them as something like a light touch on my shoulder. So it might be something very subtle when you get that physical sensation, but they also speak to us through, you know, through our mind and through our thoughts. And so I think my wife is getting that as well.
Beautiful. And Kayla, does she say that she feels Shayna, or what has her intuitive experience been with it all?
Kayla is very private about her experiences, so I can't share too much. I will just say that Kayla has natural mediumistic abilities, and she has had incredible communications with Shayna. Um, One thing she won't mind me sharing this because this is already public. One day we were watching. I just had this overwhelming urge. I had to watch that movie. I think it's called Heaven is Real. The little boy dies and goes to heaven and comes
Yeah,
back.
yeah.
And so I'm like, I don't know why. So I was, this was back when I had to go to Redbox. So I'm driving all over town. They were out of it in Redbox. I get back home. I put the movie in. Kayla wasn't interested in watching it. My wife wasn't interested in watching, but Kayla started watching with me. And so this scene comes up and he sees a picture of Jesus. And he says, that's what Jesus looks like. The father had been showing him all these pictures. He goes, that's not what it looks like. So it's drawn by this woman named Akian. She was a little girl at the time. So anyway, I get out my iPad. I start showing Kayla this woman's work because she's incredible. And Kayla had never heard of her. And suddenly Kayla's face just kind of got really still. And I saw tears come up in her eyes. And I thought she was going to pass out. And I said, what's wrong? And she looked at this picture. She said, where's this picture from? And I said, well, Kayla, I don't know. This girl drew it and she called it heaven. And Kayla goes, I had a dream the other night and I was in that church with Shayna. And she told me about this dream. They were drawing or something. They like draw together. She said, is it white on the inside? And I said, Kayla, I don't know. It's a painting. But so that was just one of the experiences that she had.
I love that because one of the things I get to do, I'm so blessed in my work, is I get to guide people on soul regression journeys, because I'm a soul regression therapist. And so almost every day, I'm taking somebody through meditation and then into the divine realms to community. I want them to have their own even tactile experience with their departed, and then talk to their guide, and I'll take them along to the Council of Elders meeting place. And so I'll ask them, I'll say, what does it look like to you? What are you experiencing? And Brian, like day after day, clients say the exact same thing. Like they'll say, oh, the gathering area is this stone circle and I'm sitting on a stone bench, and the meeting place is a domed white building. And they're all describing these same places. And even if we doubt, what are the divine realms like? Are there layers where there are buildings and nature? And I've personally traveled there because I have such a weird brain that I go there in dreams and experiences, but then to hear it validated like day after day by total strangers going there and reporting it just makes it, like you said at the beginning, we go from believing in something to knowing that it's true.
Right.
And I can relate to Shayna's story about feeling she had been to heaven because gosh, so many times in my life, I have, left the body and gone into these realms. I have these sacred pools that I would go and swim in, like in a dream vision. And I'd wake up and I'd be telling everybody, oh my gosh, I got to swim in these pools that were in heaven and I got healed. And I would describe everything about it. And then I've had other clients tell me they've gone to pools just like that to be healed and cleansed. And, this world is so much more amazing and complex and layered than our left brains want to acknowledge. And the greatest adventure and the best part of life is saying yes to the mysteries and going all in for it. Or your whole life is spent focusing on the logical left brain drudgery of survival here. Like, who wants that, right?
Right. Well, it is. I'm a very rational person, but I have come to believe that the world is rational, but it's also magical in a sense. And I just recently read, because it's kept coming up to me, Tom Campbell's book called Theory of Everything, My Big Toe. And he's a physicist, but I didn't know before I read the book that he also attended the Monroe Institute. So he learned to do all these out of body travels. So it's a very heavy scientific book, but it's also called from the fact that he's been to other dimensions and other realms. And he explains all this stuff and various timelines and probabilities and different dimensions, et cetera, from a very scientific point of view. And so I just read that recently, and now I'm listening to the Seth material. So I just started reading that book, and I'm like, it's the exact same thing. It's like he's saying the same thing that Seth said, which is the same thing like A Course in Miracles says.
Right.
So that's why it's really interesting to look at these things that came from all these different sources saying the same thing. And as a rational person, if different things from different sources are saying the same thing, then it's probably true.
Exactly. And, that's what can really validate for grieving people, especially grieving parents, that they don't want to believe in woo-woo. I've had so many clients, say, I've just never believed in woo-woo stuff. And I go, well, you're missing half of the reality that we're living in. Like, you've got to go into both. You've got to go into the woo-woo and to the logic, and then you get the full picture. And I've even been going around saying, we have to say yes to the woo. That's what we have to do to understand life in
Yeah.
its full dimension. And I remember I fought against being called woo-woo for a long time. Like when I was doing my intuitive work and 20 years ago and doing intuitive numerology, people would go, oh, Sue does that woo-woo stuff, and my family of origin, for example, in the South, they still consider it a bunch of malarkey. And then I just go, well, then I think you're not very educated, because you haven't studied quantum physics, you haven't investigated all of this, even the history of Christianity, the history of religion. Because when you go at it in a logic way, you get an answer that it is so real. And it is, according to quantum physics, it is more real than this physical world. And that's why I love quantum physics.
Yeah, and again, that thing that we call woo woo, and one of the things I've been saying lately is that there is no supernatural. Is what we don't understand yet. So everything is natural when we understand it. And if you go back, 100 years, 200 years, and I explain to someone there are these things called radio waves that are invisible, that carry information, and you can use them to communicate instantaneously across the world, you would say, well, that's absolutely impossible. But now we take it for granted. We do it every day. So people say, well, a spirit can't, travel through time, or you can't live without your brain. Well, we just don't understand it yet. Obviously, we can, and we're starting to come back. Really, we were farther ahead about 200 years ago, about 100 years, 150, 200 years ago, when people like Einstein and Heisenberg and Schrodinger and Max Planck, they all understood that consciousness was primary. And then we forgot it again. And so we're starting to come back around, because we're starting to look at, we're starting to do some experiments with quantum mechanics, double slit experiment everybody's talked about. So yes, consciousness is a very real thing. And in fact, I would go as far as say consciousness is the only thing there is.
I totally agree. It's the only real truth happening on this fake reality called human life.
Yeah.
And
So
go ahead. No, you go.
Well, no, as again, I'm reading the Seth material. I was reading Tom Campbell's book. So for people that think of woo woo, I challenge you to read My Big Toe. Now it's a long series of books. There's a lot there. But if you think, okay, well, the world is only material, and this is why I believe it's only material, he does a great job of laying it out for you as to why this is not the only dimension and why this isn't the ultimate dimension.
I love that. And, quantum physics, I got fascinated by it around 2004 when that movie came out, What the Bleep Do We Know? And I just dug into all of those quantum physics studies, and the physics that was just so amazing to me, because here we have a lab where they are proving that time and space are happening all at once. That's a concept that our left brain can't get around. And I remember when I was grieving, one of the concepts that bothered me, that kept me from communicating with my husband, Paul, was that I lived in Boulder, and Boulder is such a Buddhist community. And they would say, oh, you don't want to talk to them because you're going to hold them back. They're going to go reincarnate or go on. And so I would think, oh, well, if Paul comes to me, I shouldn't really embrace that. And Paul did come to me so much, And then I finally learned that is baloney, because time and space is happening all at once. So even if our loved ones have moved on and have incarnated, their spirit can, what is that word for it? Bilocation or something? And so we can say to them, I need your guidance, or lift me above my struggles today. And they are instantly with us doing all of that. And in fact, Paul has come back and shown me his wonderful job that he has in the divine, where he's counseling people as soon as they cross and doing the soul review with them, which is so beautiful. And so he didn't even want to hang out and talk to me. He loved his job so much, Brian, in this dream vision. And he was like, I just have one thing to tell you. You're doing good work, but you got to tell people that suffering is not real. And I was like, wait, what do you mean? What do you mean? Before you go, because he was like wanting to run off to his job, right?
Yeah.
And so he had colon cancer, and his abdomen had been really scarred from surgeries when he crossed. And in this dream vision, he lifts up his shirt and shows me perfect porcelain, like spirit skin, untouched by any pain. And he goes, you got to tell those grieving people that suffering is not real. The soul never suffers. And then he was off to his job. And I was like, wait, don't you miss me? Come back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you have those kinds of experiences, you wake up going, my gosh, I want to go there. I want a job like that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that brings me to the point of I tell people we grieve for two reasons. We grieve our loved ones because of what we feel like they've lost, and we grieve what we've lost. And so what I try to do with people is I want to eliminate you grieving for them, because they're okay. They are better than okay. We're still at work, we're at school, whatever you want to call it, we're in training. They're on vacation. So don't feel bad for the person that's crossed over. And I've gotten some indication that Shane is doing similar type of work. And time and space, there's a debate about whether there's time there or not, and it depends on how you define time, I guess. But what we can say for sure is that it's different. And
It's
so
not,
they don't
that it's
perceive.
not linear. Yeah,
It's different. So and there's this concept that I can't get my head around. That all time happens at once. It keeps coming up. I don't understand it. I don't think you can understand it from within the human brain. But the thing is, we're not constrained once we cross over. So we can be in multiple places at the same time, or we can travel so fast that it feels like we're in multiple places at the same time.
So, Brian, what would you have to say to a very logical person who lost someone they love, and they don't want to be foolish, and they don't want to believe in woo-woo, and yet their heart is broken, and they come to you, pretend they're coming to you going, Brian, what do you have to say to help me? What would you say?
Yeah, well, actually, the course that I just developed, it's really for those people. So I would recommend the course. I'm not just trying to sell the course.
And the course is called what again?
It's called Love Never Dies.
Okay.
And so if you go to my website, grieftogrowth.com/love never dies, I don't know how many parts it is. I'm still putting the finishing touches on it, and it'll be developing over time. But what I say to clients is I usually work with them in a series of meetings, and we talk, first of all, like about their grief and what they're experiencing, and how to deal with the grief, because that's the first thing, right? Guilt is a big thing that happens a lot in grief. So I always explore, is there any guilt here? Is there any unforgiveness? We need to get those things out of the way. And then we start talking about, what are your core beliefs? What is it that you believe now? Why do you believe what you believe now? And what would it take for you to feel differently? And then I provide, resources. You can read this book, you read this book. There's a study. There's, personal experiences, anecdotes like I'm sharing with you. But it's like, you don't have to just believe. In fact, I don't. And when people, a lot of times in religion, one of the bad things about religion, and there's good things about it, of course, but one of the bad things is they just say, just take it on faith. And that can work for a while until you're in crisis.
Right.
And for a lot of people, there's this unspoken covenant with God that if I do the right thing, that nothing bad's ever going to happen to me.
Right.
And then when it happens, either God doesn't exist or I'm angry with God.
Right.
So what I try to get people, let's come to a more rational view of the world. Jesus said, in the world, you're going to have trouble. Trouble is built into this life. This is part of the reason why we're here, is to experience the contrast. As Paul said, suffering, I don't like to say it's not real. It's not the ultimate reality. The pain that we go through is real. The emotions that we feel are real. So I don't want to tell someone your feelings aren't real.
I agree.
But the pain is temporary. It's like, another analogy used, and I'll stop, is like when a child falls and skins their knee. As a parent, we look at them, we say, oh, you're okay. You just skinned your knee. But they're screaming bloody murder, like they just broke their leg. They're never going to walk again. But as an adult, our perspective is like, yeah, I know it hurts, but it's going to be okay. That's the perspective of spirit. So
Yeah.
it's not like the pain isn't real. It's just like the pain's not as bad as you think it is, and it's not going to last that long.
Right.
So if we can get in that mindset, if we can make that shift from the earthly mindset to the more spiritual mindset on demand,
Yeah.
then we can endure what we have to go through.
And on demand to me just means, at least in my life, it means, okay, Paul, Chrissy, Marv, Dad, all my posse and the kids I've worked with who I love, lift me above this moment. And that all you have to say is lift me above this moment. Show me this, my soul's perspective on this, or your
Exactly.
perspective on this. Instantly, because they want us to evolve. Those spirits want us to wake up here and
Right.
understand that the soul is eternal. So I won't keep you any longer. I know you're busy, but again, to the listeners, Grief to Growth is Brian Smith's book and his podcast. And I could talk to you forever. The
Oh,
Gemini
yeah.
mind meets the Virgo mind here.
Yeah. It went way too fast. Would you do it again?
Thank you so much, Brian. It's been an absolute pleasure. And this is Sue Frederick signing off. And if you have any more desire to listen to mystical conversations, you can go to SueFrederick.com, my website, for more information. It's a blessing. Until we meet again. Bye-bye.